The Pawn Stars family business at Gold and Silver Pawn Shop means Rick Harrison's decisions don't just affect the bottom line, they ignite explosive confrontations with son Cory Harrison and late patriarch Richard the Old Man Harrison that History Channel cameras have captured for years. Million-dollar mistakes, boats purchased without permission, fake antiques that fooled the experts, and deals that fell apart over a few $100s have all sparked heated showdowns between the Harrison clan, and what you're about to see proves that mixing family with reality television business creates drama no script could invent. We're starting with the purchase that nearly destroyed Cory's relationship with his father and cost the shop over $20,000. Act 1. The boat that almost sank everything. Cory Harrison knew exactly what he was doing when he met a seller to look at a boat in Las Vegas, and he knew his father Rick would kill him for it. The old man always said Rick hates boats, always has, which is why Cory didn't bother asking permission before dropping serious cash on one that needed major work at Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. The seller laid it out honestly, repeating what his own father had warned him for years. Boats are just holes in the water where you throw money. That wisdom didn't stop Cory from handing over $16,500 for a vessel that clearly needed repairs. And when Rick found out on this memorable Pawn Stars episode, the explosion was immediate and brutal. Rick's rule at the pawn shop isn't complicated. You don't spend that kind of money until you ask him first. Not Richard Harrison, not anybody else. His exact words captured the fury of a man watching his son gamble with company cash. It doesn't take many stupid decisions like this to sink a company. Every dollar Cory had committed came without expert assessment from their regular marine specialist, Mark Hall Patton, without knowing repair costs, and without any authorization whatsoever, which in a business where cash flow determines survival, meant Cory had potentially created a disaster. What happened next surprised everyone on this History Channel reality television moment, starting with Rick himself. An expert came in to examine the boat and delivered news nobody expected. This was actually a really special find, worth significantly more than the purchase price. The catch was simple and terrifying for Cory. The repairs had to stay under $10,000, or the whole deal would become a financial nightmare. Tension built as restoration work proceeded, with Cory knowing that every dollar spent brought him closer to either vindication or another round of his father's anger. When the Harrison family gathered to see the finished boat, Rick asked what everyone was thinking. What's the damage? $4,000. That's what the restorer had spent. Rick thought it was going to be something horrendous, so the relief on his face was visible when he heard the number. Total investment came to $20,500, $16,500 for the boat, plus $4,000 in restoration. And while the final selling price exceeded expectations, Rick's positive reaction suggested Cory might have accidentally scored a win. Cory thought Rick was going to kiss him right there. What this Pawn Stars showdown reveals about the Harrison family matters more than the boat itself. Rick maintains iron control over major purchases because one bad deal really can damage the pawnbroker business. But sometimes risk-taking pays off even when it starts by violating every rule Rick has set. Not that Cory should count on getting lucky twice, because unauthorized purchases don't always end with restored boats and relieved fathers. Our next confrontation proves that point perfectly. Act 2. The Wells Fargo Disaster. Rick Harrison considers himself an expert on Old West memorabilia and antiques, which made what happened next even more embarrassing for the Pawn Stars patriarch. A seller walked into Gold and Silver Pawn Shop with what appeared to be a Wells Fargo strongbox and an antique ball and chain, claiming the restraints came from the Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona, which opened in the 1870s before Arizona even became a state. The ball and chain raised immediate red flags for Rick, because chains forged in the 1800s required hot welding, heating metal, and beating it together by hand in blacksmith shops. Arc welding didn't exist back then. Everything came from blacksmiths working with fire and hammer. And the biggest problem Rick spotted was the prison name stamped right on the ball. Manufacturers wouldn't change their die for every prison, Rick explained. Only fakes had names stamped on the balls. Despite catching the fraudulent restraints, Rick still negotiated for the Wells Fargo strongbox on this memorable History Channel episode. These boxes generate collector interest because they appear in old Hollywood westerns, which is why Rick felt confident offering $400 against the seller's $1,200 asking price. They settled at $450, and Rick walked away thinking he'd scored a solid piece of American frontier history. Expert Steve Grad destroyed that confidence in seconds. "I don't have good news for you. This is a complete fantasy piece. It's a complete fake." Rick's response was just one word: damn it. The expert explained that Wells Fargo strongboxes rank among the most faked antiques out there, and while this one showed quality construction with cast iron handles, good hardware, and proper riveting, it definitely wasn't worth the $450 Rick had paid. What made the situation worse was the expert's next admission. He thought it was fake from the beginning but didn't want to bust Rick's bubble on camera. Rick's exasperation came through clearly. "So you let me spend the money instead? So now I can holler at you?" This Pawn Stars exchange exposes something important about how the shop operates. Even experts who work regularly with Rick sometimes hold back to avoid confrontation, or because they assume he knows better. Staying quiet in this case cost Rick $450 on a complete fake, which at least was only a few hundred lost. The next family confrontation involved thousands and created one of the biggest rifts between father and son ever filmed. Act 3. The Triumph Motorcycle Betrayal. Rick gave Cory and Austin Chumley Russell an assignment that should have been simple. Drive to Carson City where someone had a 1970 Triumph 650 Tiger motorcycle for sale. Negotiate down from the $10,000 asking price to around $8,000 and bring it back to Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. Rick's instructions couldn't have been clearer. "As long as it runs good, I want it." What Rick didn't emphasize enough, apparently, was that this wasn't just another inventory item for the pawn shop. Rick rides Triumph motorcycles personally, and this vintage bike was something he wanted for his personal collection, which meant the usual profit calculations didn't apply to this Pawn Stars deal. Cory and Chum met with a seller who owned a custom motorcycle parts business in Nevada, a company that manufactures frames, gas tanks, oil tanks, handlebars, and 5,000 different components used by custom bike builders across the country. The Triumph he showed them had been bought in 1999 and sent to his nephew, who spent 3 years restoring it from a pallet of parts to factory floor condition. The engine ran like a sewing machine, smooth and precise. Chum admitted something unexpected on this History Channel episode. He'd never liked Triumph motorcycles, but this one was actually tickling him a little. The bike was clean, the restoration work was excellent, everything checked out mechanically, and the seller pointed out a fact Cory didn't want to hear. In the 60s and 70s, Triumphs were hands down better machines than Harley-Davidson motorcycles, faster and more technologically advanced. Cory remained skeptical about whether the bike met his motorcycle standards, whatever those were. Negotiations began with the seller holding firm at $10,000, calling it a reasonable price for the restoration quality. Cory offered $6,000, which was insulting given what sat in front of him. When the seller wouldn't budge, Cory went to $8,000, and the seller came down to $7,500. $300 separated them from a deal, and that's where Cory made the mistake that would infuriate his father. Cory offered $7,200 and refused to go higher. Even Antoine, who was with them, recognized that Rick would be furious if they didn't close the deal over such a small difference. The seller held at $7,500. Cory wouldn't move, and the deal fell apart over $300. When they returned to the Pawn Stars shop empty-handed, Rick's anger escalated from confusion to fury. He'd given them explicit instructions to buy the bike, not to evaluate whether it was worth it or profitable, but to buy it because he wanted it for himself. Cory tried defending his decision by claiming there was no money to be made, insisting he'd done Rick a favor, which only made things worse. Rick's response cut deep and laid bare the real issue. "No, son, I wanted the bike for myself." What followed was a harsh assessment of the entire trip captured by History Channel cameras. I basically paid for you guys to have a vacation. Your son Cory decided not to buy the bike over $300. Rick's final statement revealed his complete disappointment in Cory's judgment. You know what? This is all my fault. I should have never sent you guys. This confrontation highlights the fundamental conflict that runs through their working relationship on Pawn Stars. Cory approaches almost every purchase from a pure profit perspective, calculating margins and upside, while Rick understands that some purchases have value that doesn't show up on a pawnbroker balance sheet. Personal relationships with sellers matter, maintaining Rick's collection matters, and honoring commitments matters. But by nickel and diming over $300, Cory had damaged Rick's relationship with a significant parts manufacturer and denied his father something he specifically wanted. The lesson hit hard. Sometimes in the pawn shop business, being cheap costs you far more than being generous. Rick's mistakes created family tension too, though sometimes his instincts paid off in ways nobody expected. Act 4. When Rick scores big, the $100,000 samurai sword. A seller walked into gold and silver pawn shop with what he claimed was a Japanese samurai katana, not a ninja sword as someone mistakenly called it, but a genuine katana made around the year 1600 by a fifth-generation swordsmith from the Shinto period. The blade showed traditional Japanese craftsmanship that takes special people to create, and the seller wanted $5,000 for this piece of samurai history. Rick admitted right away that he didn't know enough about Japanese swords and samurai culture to pay that kind of money, which started negotiations down a more reasonable path. The seller came to $2,000. Rick countered at $1,500, and they shook hands on a deal that Rick admitted was a complete gamble on this memorable Pawn Stars episode. He was baffled by what he'd bought, which is when calling in an expert made all the difference. The katana expert properly disassembled the sword using traditional Japanese methods that have been used for centuries, removing the handle to check for a signature. He found one, and the news kept getting better. The swordsmith was indeed a fifth-generation maker from the late 1600s during Japan's Edo period, and he was rare. In its as-found condition, the sword was worth about $5,000 to $6,000. Already a solid return on Rick's $1,500 investment. But the expert suggested restoration, and that's when Rick's decades of experience and network of specialists created massive value for gold and silver pawn shop. Rick sent the blade to a professionally trained Japanese polisher who specialized in traditional samurai sword restoration, had the handle rewrapped by another specialist familiar with authentic Japanese techniques, and brought the sword to 100% restored condition. Total restoration cost was $3,300, which meant Rick had $4,800 total invested when you added the purchase price. The expert's final valuation came in at $115,000. Rick had turned less than $5,000 into a katana worth over $100,000. And when he asked when anyone in the Harrison family had last tripled their money, the answer was obvious. Never like this on Pawn Stars. This success story demonstrates exactly why Rick maintains control over major purchases at gold and silver pawn shop. His experience and willingness to invest in proper restoration created value that Cory's penny-pinching approach never could have achieved. Even Rick's big wins create teaching moments, though, as the next story proves. Act 5. The Comic Book Gamble. Boxes of comic books arrived at gold and silver pawn shop, courtesy of a woman whose deceased uncle had left his collection to her, and Rick started digging through them with growing excitement on this History Channel episode. Dracula, Doctor Strange, and other potentially valuable comic book titles appeared as he sorted through the stacks, though Chumley had no idea what Doctor Strange even was. Rick explained that Doctor Strange alone should be worth a few $100s to comic book collectors, which is why the woman's asking price of $2,000 for everything seemed potentially reasonable. The problem Rick acknowledged was that even if $2,000 worth of value existed somewhere in these boxes, finding the diamonds in the rough would take significant time and effort. He offered $50 per box, $350 total for 7 boxes, and they negotiated up to $500. Rick made the deal with complete confidence, telling everyone at Pawn Stars he'd show them what an expert he really is. He knew there would be good stuff in there, or at least he thought he knew. Chum, being skeptical by nature, suggested Rick call someone who actually knows comic books to verify the purchase. Expert Rebecca Romney arrived and pulled out the valuable issues one by one. First Taskmaster, First Nova, Red Hulk, Doctor Strange, and some other decent comic book titles. The entire stack of good comics was worth about $200 at retail, which sounds okay until you consider what that meant for everything else. The other couple £100 of comic books? About 5 cents per book if Rick was lucky, essentially worthless except as recycling. Rick had spent $500 on comic books he'd be lucky to get $180 out of, plus 7 boxes of paper that might fetch a few bucks at a recycling center. While not a complete disaster, since the boxes did have some recoverable value, Rick had clearly overpaid and overestimated his expertise in an area he didn't know as well as he thought. This Pawn Stars story shows what happens when Rick ventures outside his core knowledge without following his own rules. Unlike the Japanese katana, where Rick knew to call experts and invest in restoration, with the comic books, Rick let confidence override judgment. No one is an expert in everything, a humbling reminder that even Rick needed to learn occasionally. Sometimes confrontations aren't about expertise at all, though. They're about family members trusting each other's knowledge, which brings us to a bet that ended with Cory washing his father's car. Act 6. The Aztec Money Bet. Unusual copper pieces shaped like small axes arrived at gold and silver pawn shop with a seller who claimed they were Aztec Empire money from the 1500s, what's called axe money in numismatic collector circles. Rick thought they were pretty cool, explaining that Central America and the Aztec Empire didn't have stamped currency back then, so these pieces served as a transition into formal monetary systems. Cory immediately questioned whether they were actually pre-Columbian currency or just novelty items like any gift shop in Mexico sells. The seller wanted $25 each, $75 total for 3 pieces, which sparked a bet between father and son on this Pawn Stars episode that revealed their ongoing dynamic. Rick was confident these were real Aztec artifacts. Cory was equally confident they were tourist trinkets, and the stakes were simple. If Rick was right, Cory had to take Rick's car to the car wash and give it a nice wax. The expert who arrived at gold and silver pawn shop delivered his verdict without hesitation. These were absolutely genuine Aztec Empire currency. The Aztecs polished these pieces to a silvery white appearance, and the patina on these examples confirmed authenticity beyond doubt. Each piece was worth about $150 or more to collectors of pre-Columbian artifacts, putting total value at $450. Rick had won the bet, which meant Cory was heading to the car wash. But Rick also made a smart business move instead of just gloating. He acknowledged that Cory would be bragging all day about the bet, so Rick offered $225 for all 3 Aztec pieces, and the seller accepted immediately. $225 for antiques worth $450 at retail meant Rick had locked in a 50% margin, while still giving the seller triple his asking price. Everyone won except Cory, who had to spend his afternoon detailing his father's car. This Pawn Stars confrontation perfectly illustrates what plays out between Rick and Cory again and again. Rick's experience and knowledge consistently prove valuable, while Cory's skepticism, though occasionally warranted, more often leads him into embarrassing situations. The car wash was a small price to pay for a lesson in humility, though whether Cory actually learned anything remains questionable. Conclusion. Every confrontation at gold and silver pawn shop reveals the same tension that exists in any family business. Balancing personal relationships with professional responsibilities creates conflicts that regular businesses never face, especially when History Channel cameras are rolling. Cory bought the boat without permission and violated Rick's trust, but got lucky when restoration costs came in low. Rick bought the fake Wells Fargo box, and even expert Steve Grad stayed quiet to avoid confrontation. Cory refused to spend an extra $300 on the Triumph motorcycle and cost Rick something he personally wanted while damaging a business relationship. Rick invested in the Japanese katana, and his expertise turned $1,500 into over $100,000. Rick gambled on comic books outside his area of knowledge and lost money. Rick bet Cory on Aztec Empire currency, and experience triumphed over skepticism. The pattern that emerges from years of Pawn Stars episodes is clear. Success in the pawnbroker business requires expertise, humility, and knowing when to trust your instincts versus when to trust your experts. Balancing profit margins with relationships matters, and most importantly, family members must respect each other's roles and follow established protocols. Rick's final words about the motorcycle disaster sum up the reality television drama perfectly. "This is all my fault. I should have never sent you guys." Sometimes the hardest lesson for a family business owner is accepting that certain decisions can't be delegated, no matter how badly you want family members to step up and prove themselves. These heated showdowns prove that running the gold and silver pawn shop isn't just about knowing the value of antiques, samurai swords, or vintage motorcycles that come through the door. Trust, experience, and following through on your word matter more than any item that gets hauled into the shop. And sometimes, those intangible assets are worth more than everything in the inventory combined.